Today on Steph Talk TV, we're continuing our series on addiction. Episodes 2 and 3. We're going to do them in a combo today. Episode 2, we'll discuss the mind of an addict, and in episode 3, we will be discussing the road to recovery. My special guests today are Michael Young and Pastor Brian Hill. Michael Young, aka Charismatic Cheetah, has a podcast, YouTube channel, and a funny Facebook meme page. He's been clean since 2019 and he works in substance abuse treatment as a case manager. He has a beautiful wife who he says is his very best friend and a strong relationship with Christ. Brian Hill is a pastor at Fort Graham Baptist Church. He has a wife and 7 children, ranging from the ages of 13 to 20. He works in treatment. He's been doing this for 10 years, and he is 10 years sober. Brian is going to help us better understand the mind of an addict, and Michael is going to go over the road to recovery. Let's listen as Brian tells us about the mind of an addict.
When we look at the disease model of addiction, what we do is we view addiction as a progressive and a relapse in disease, like rather than just a moral failure or a lack of willpower, right? But we do also understand that addiction itself is irreversible. But if we can maintain abstinence, right, we cannot use, then what we can do is we can arrest the disease and keep it dormant. When we get into the mind, it meets all the necessary qualifications to be considered a brain disorder or a brain disease. And it affects our behavior in our brain and leads us to just an inability to control our use. So your brain is like a really, really complex computer, which I'm not a nerd when it comes to that stuff. So I wouldn't be able to tell you. Yeah, what I know is just from experience. I'm, not educated or anything like that. But when we look at the way the brain communicates, it communicates through a bunch of circuits and different connection points and transmitters called neurotransmitters and neuroreceptors. In between the two neurons, you have what's called a synapse, which is just a connection point, and that's what allows the two transmitters to communicate to each other. And so when we get into using drugs and alcohol and stuff like that, like your brain sends a message right through a neurotransmitter into the gap, which is called the synapse, and into the next cell. As the neurotransmitter crosses the synapse and attaches to the receptors on the receiving neuron, that's what makes things happen, right? This causes a change in the receiving cell. When we look at how drugs work in the brain, drugs interfere with the way that neurons send, receive, and process signals via the neurotransmitters. Some drugs, like heroin and marijuana, they activate neurons because their structure, the way their chemical makeup mimics a natural neurotransmitter in the body. And that allows the drugs to just attach to active neurons and be sent out, right? And even though the drugs mimic the brain's own chemicals, they don't activate the neurons in a natural way. So that leads to what we call abnormal messages being sent through the network. When you get into amphetamines or cocaines and other psychostimulants, what this does is it causes neurons to release abnormally large amounts of natural neurotransmitters, or it prevents the normal recycling of the brain's chemicals by interfering with the transporters. That also amplifies or disrupts the normal communication between the neurons. When you look at your brain, you got a bunch of different parts of your brain, and I'll try to make it as layman's term. First things first, anytime you use alcohol, anytime you use a drug, you are changing your brain. Period. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It changes the chemical makeup. It has an effect. So you have this part of your brain called the basal ganglia. This is your motivation. This is things that we do, that pleasurable effects, like when maybe eating or socializing or having sex. And it's also the part of the brain that creates habits and routines. The areas form what's called a key node of the reward circuit. So we can just call that the reward circuit of the brain. The thing that when I do something and it feels good, my brain lights up and says, pleasure. So drugs overactivate that circuit, producing a euphoria, which is called being high. If we keep doing it over and over and over again, what happens is that part of the brain, the circuit there, then adapts to the presence of the drug. And so it makes our sensitivity to the drug go down, which means that it makes it harder to feel pleasure. So if the drug's not there, I can struggle with feeling pleasure in things that I used to find pleasure in. That's why a lot of times when you see somebody's addiction progress, maybe they were good at football, they stopped playing football, then find pleasure in that. Maybe they were a great artist and they're not able to just find pleasure in the thing that they love unless the drug is present. And then you have another part of your brain. Let's just call this the stress center. This is the part of the brain that creates stress and anxiety and irritability and unease. This is what happens whenever we're withdrawing after the drug high fades and the person's motivation to seek the drug again goes up because internally their mind is telling them we're not okay. I'm uneasy. I don't feel good. I'm angry. Or you'll see somebody who's craving the drug be super edgy with somebody that they really, really love and care about. And so that circuit, what that does, how the other part of the brain gets diminished and the sensitivity goes down, this circuit, our sensitivity goes up. So we become increasingly irritable and like discontented and unease. And if we don't have the drug, then we get really upset. And so what happens over time is a person with a substance use disorder will start using drugs just to get temporary relief from our own misery rather than to actually get high. And then you have this, and this part of the brain to me is probably the most important is your prefrontal cortex. This is your decision making part of your brain, right? This helps you think, this helps you plan. This is where you solve problems, make decisions, exert self control over impulses. Like I always use the example of like if I said, Stephanie, tomorrow, how about we get together and we go rob a bank? You're going to say,
No.
no, right. So that is the proper execution of the prefrontal cortex. You automatically
Mm-hmm.
say that's a bad idea. I'm not going to do it. That part of the brain is just a side note here. It's the last part of the brain to mature, and this is why teenagers are so susceptible and vulnerable to drug addiction and alcoholism, right? So the balance shifts between our prefrontal cortex and the circuits of the stress and the pleasure zones, and it make a person with a substance use disorder, we can kind of seek the drug compulsively and have low impulse control.
Hmm.
That's kind of the gist of how it works. It's a lot more intricate than that. Prolonged use, your prefrontal cortex actually deteriorates, right? So your brain is made up of all kinds of wrinkles, right? And wrinkles
Mm-hmm.
kind of represent functionality and knowledge and stuff like that. Well, when I'm using drugs and I'm triggering that pleasure center of my mind and I'm stimulating it over and over and over and over again, I'm not using this part. I'm not using that decision making part. And the brain's kind of one of those things. If you don't use it, you lose it.
Right.
As this is diminishing and this is not being activated as much, and it's essentially deteriorating, it starts to smooth out. Instead of being wrinkled, it may look like an apple almost, just smooth. What that signifies is that our parental cortex is not being used appropriately. Altogether, the brain adapts to the presence of the drug. Right. And then you have another part of your brain called the midbrain, which is your most primitive part. This is your survival instincts where fight or flight comes into play. And with certain drugs like opiates, there is a negative response when the drug is not present. We call this withdrawal. And so the brain is saying something bad is happening to us. We need to survive. You're talking about fighting a part of your brain that's existed since creation and is literally the part of your brain that is meant to protect you from bad things. And when
Mm-hmm.
that thing gets in control and says, we got to have that drug to survive. The pleasure system,
Mm.
you're not even getting high anymore. You ever talk to long term addicts? They'll say at the end, for me, the last several years, there was no pleasure in what I was doing. It was simply just force a habit. It was routine. And my mind says, we got to have it, we got to have it, we got to have it. And then once I put it in, my body says, we got to have more. So like that's that old adage, like one is too many and hundreds never enough. Like the part that's irreversible for the addict My stepmother, she's been with my dad for 20 years. I've seen her maybe intoxicated twice in the whole 20 years. She's the type of lady that she could pour a glass of wine and pour it out. You know what I mean? Never
Right.
even finish the glass of wine. I don't operate that way. And I was never much of an alcoholic, but I knew people with drugs who could do the same thing. They could just take a hit or two, they'd be fine. And I'm over here like, what are we doing? And they're like, oh, I'm good. I'm like, well, cool, but don't you want to be better? Like my body responds with this thing we call an allergy. In the land of AA, we call it the allergy or the phenomenon of craving. It's something that just doesn't happen in your normal temperate drinker or user. We believe the main problem centers here. This is why a person with a year sober can relapse, because their mind is still not okay. Essentially what happens is you imagine trying to fight your own brain when your brain is telling you, I've got to have this thing to survive. And even though you know intellectually you can connect every dot, saying this is going to be bad, this is not going to end well, this is going to hurt my wife. We do things whether sober or not when we're in that way of thinking, that it pours out into the people that we love, and they think that we don't love them or we hate them or that, whatever. It's not that. How I'm supposed to fight my own mind? Over here in Fort Worth, we have a place called Stop Six, and Stop Six is got a lot of bloods, gang members. I always tell people, like, the addict trying to fight his own mind is like a crip going in the Stop Six and picking a fight. He's not going to win. This is not about making better decisions. We can wish and hope and try to make better decisions all we want.
That's a great analogy. Wow. Wow.
That's what it's like for us. We have people in our lives saying, hey, get better, just stop. It's a choice. Don't do it. Pick yourself up by your bootstraps. People coming at us about this, and unless you've been through it, you truly don't understand. And I've said it before, bless those people for their ignorance. I'm
Right.
glad that they don't know the truth. I pray that they never experience it in their own lives or in the lives of somebody that they know. I hope that they can, after a long, happy life, completely oblivious and ignorant to the reality of addiction. I hope that they
Right.
can.
But what happens with people like that's me,
Yeah.
but we become a different type of addict. We become codependent.
Yes.
And person is your addiction.
Yeah.
And you have opened up just such a floodgate of information for me to better understand my situation with that I'm not saying those things again. Why don't you just pick yourself up by your bootstraps?
No.
And
Well, from experience, what I can tell you that does is we will try and we will fail.
I
And when we
mhm.
fail, we're gonna feel about this big. And I'll tell you, like I work with the families at the treatment center that I work at now in Azle, called the Stonegate Center. It's faith based, and one of the things they brought me in to do is rebuild their family day programming. And I tell the families, every time we meet, I say, listen, you couldn't have stopped this and you couldn't have caused it. Period. You need to know that off the bat. You are simply not that powerful. Okay. The other thing I tell them is our illness is unique in the sense that, like, it it meshes, it envelops the whole family unit, and we're not the individual addict or alcoholic is not the only sufferer. Our families, especially moms, and dads, especially parents, they can get so enmeshed in our illness. They can get enmeshed to where our disease becomes their disease. And codependency can come up, and all sorts of other feelings and emotions. It may lead them to tying one on every now and then, just trying to get drunk and forget about it. Guilt, shame, embarrassment, all the stuff. And
I
if I had cancer, my wife would not have cancer, and she would have worry and fear and stuff like that, but it would not involve her the way that active addiction would. And so one of the things I always tell the families, and if you're a family watching, listen, you've got to recover. You have to get better for two reasons. Number one, you cannot allow your health and your well-being to be determined by the health and the well-being of the addict or the alcoholic. It's you're setting yourself up for failure there. Number two, if they get better and you're not better, you're not going to know how to handle them well. And so you're going to still live like they're sick. And that's going to create more dysfunction and toxicity within the family unit. And ultimately, it could cause more harm than good. So I tell every family member, if you have a loved one who is suffering from this illness, and it is enveloping your life in such a way that is making you sick, find a path to recovery, whether it be Al-Anon, whether it be Celebrate Recovery, support groups at church, whatever it looks like, because you got to be able to be okay, whether the alcoholic or the addict is okay or not. I'll tell you this. My dad and I have a better relationship now than we ever had before addiction, right? He was my best friend in high school. After my mom passed away, my dad were thick as thieves. And then drugs came in and we got separated. Our relationship now, though, whenever we used to talk about the good old days, like now we're talking about, like, I would never take the relationship I had before drugs with him over this one, because this one is so special and unique. We have a different bond because, yes, he stayed with me all the way through it. And some family members, they can't do that, and that's okay. You don't have to feel guilty about doing whatever you have to do to protect yourself and the rest of the family unit. If you got to move,
because it could end up you needing to protect yourself sometimes.
yes. The addict doesn't need to hear just stop doing it, because we've thought about not doing it anymore. We don't need to hear pick yourself up by your bootstraps, because we've tried with all of our own volition to stop.
Thank you, Brian, for sharing with us the mind of an addict. It is truly essential for those supporting people struggling with addiction and their loved ones. Now we'll hear from Michael Young as he tells us about the road to recovery.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
I really appreciate you guys. You have
It's
no
an honor.
idea.
But the first time was very early on. So I was 14 or 15 years old. I'd already been smoking pot and experimenting, as they say, with stuff like that, but nothing crazy. I was just drinking, smoking weed. But so I was at my mom's house and my stepdad's house, and I had this trampoline pushed up to this basketball goal, and I was slam dunking, from the trampoline. Well, I jumped and I messed up, and I basically hit my nose on the rim and broke my nose. Still a little messed up from that. And it hurt really bad. It was a lot of pain. Of course, it's bleeding everywhere. Well, I go inside and my mom gives me some Tylenol or something. And my stepdad at the time, this is early 2000s. This is the height of the pain pill epidemic. This is when, you cut your finger and they'll give you some hydrocodone as a prescription. It's not like that anymore, thank God. But well, he was like, "Hey, I was in a lot of pain. It hurt. I couldn't see. It was bad." And he gave me, I think he gave me a half a hydrocodone, maybe a whole one, uh, aka Vicodin, Lortab. There's different names for them. I took it, and I'm sitting there. I remember the moment, like it was yesterday. I took the hydrocodone, and I'm sitting there watching NASCAR. It was a Sunday. I was supposed to go back home to Dad, so supposed to go back to his house later that evening. I'm watching NASCAR in the living room, and all of a sudden, this is like 30 minutes later, it just hits me, and I my shoulders dropped. I felt like I could breathe. Suddenly I was comfortable in my own skin, something that I wasn't, I'm 14, 15 anyway. I'm already uncomfortable in my own skin. I don't know who I am, but more than just teenage angst is I've always kind of had that weird restlessness. But all of a sudden I was okay. I wasn't awkward anymore. Being a stepson sometimes you want to be cool around your stepdad and you want to be liked. I also had stepsisters, and suddenly I was cool. I don't know how to explain it. Remember, I walked outside. My stepsisters were, still jumping on the trampoline and stuff. And man, I just remember being like, I'm okay. This is nice. I wasn't like intoxicated in that way, but I was definitely feeling good. The pain in my nose went away. I was good. And I remember I saw where my mom, pulled the pain pill bottle out of in the cupboard in the kitchen. And I was going over every other weekend as I was going over to mom's and stepdad's house. I remember like thinking, uh, I want to feel like this for the rest of my life. I have arrived. It's almost like a spiritual experience. It was yeah, definitely the wrong spirit. Yeah. 2 weeks I go home that night, whatever, and I come back to her house 2 weeks later, and my mom and my stepdad went out to eat or something. I took basically that whole bottle, however many were left in that bottle. I took the rest of them over the course of the weekend, or just about all of them. Um, and from that moment on, I was no longer experimenting. I was in full blown. I mean, I started getting them myself, and then other pills came into play, and then other drugs like meth. I mean, it was bad enough to where first time I ever went to rehab, I was 19, so I was pretty young. It's only a few years later that I was in that I was I knew, but I knew pretty much right away. I was like, this is how I want to be for the rest of my life. Mm. I'm 35. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I've I've known for a long time. So I knew. So first time I went to rehab was in 2008. I knew that I didn't go. Like no one made me go. In fact, I remember telling my dad the first time, and he kind of didn't believe me. He's like, "Yeah, whatever, you're good. Just quit doing it." But I had to like basically be like, "No, no, Dad, I really need to go." So I was there on my own volition. I've known since at least 2008 or even before that I'm an addict. I didn't realize I was an alcoholic till later on. I've known for a long time. So you're looking at how many at least 15, 16, 17 years that I've known for a fact that I'm a drug addict and alcoholic. I mean, I don't know. I think it made like an active addiction. So I have kind of a weird. So my story is a little different than a lot of people's because a lot of people they have their active addiction period. They finally get it together, go to treatment or work some 12 steps or whatever. Or they find Jesus and they don't have to do the 12-step thing. I don't. That's not my story, but and then from that point on, however many years until they pass away, that's their clean time or sober, their recovery period. Well, mine was first time I ever got sober was in 2008, 19. I went to what's called sober living, which is like halfway house, but it's accountability. They drug test you and got to get a job, got to have a curfew, yada yada. And I went into 12-step program and got me a sponsor, which is someone that just basically helps you work through the 12 steps. And I didn't grow up in church or anything like that. So, and of course, the 12 steps are all about getting you connected to God. Start praying and and basically repenting. I worked the steps and I was a different guy. I mean, I was kind of a punk when I was 19, but halfway through the steps, I don't know, I couldn't tell you, it wasn't like a burning bush or anything like that, but something happened. I was completely different. I started praying. I started wanting to help people. I started wanting to do the right thing. I had this little girlfriend that I picked up when I moved I went to Dallas. I'm from Grandview, which is a small town. And I got a girlfriend within like a week or two. And like, she wasn't a bad influence, nothing like that. But suddenly I was just like, I don't want to be with her anymore. She's not good for me. She's not necessarily bad either. She doesn't like make me, relapse or anything. But like, it's just, I changed completely. It's just overnight. And then a couple months later, that's when I was actually introduced to Jesus and actually got saved. Um, but unfortunately, after 4.5 years, actually, I ended up relapsing and on communion wine, of all things. It wasn't a whole lot of wine, but it gave me the permission a couple months later, so I can probably drink wine, just hanging out. Anyway, and a couple months after drinking that wine, New Year's Eve in 2013 or New Year's Day, 2013, I was within a couple months. I was doing heroin for the first time, smoking crack for the first time, using needles. I mean, it just got really bad. Yeah, yeah. So it was in a glass. It was in a glass, and I took one. Yeah, yeah. Stopped. Not like I didn't pick up where I left off. I picked up like I never quit. I would say that, um, I had this idea the first time I went to rehab that, and when I realized it wasn't necessarily true, and I see a lot of people working in the industry and also, helping guys outside of work try to get sober as well. Is a common misconception is if I just figure out whatever happened in my childhood or whatever, what mental illness do I have that caused this? If I could just find that thing, if I could have that breakthrough in therapy or clinical or whatever, then I won't have to drink or use anymore because I'll be okay. I'll be self-fulfilled. And I realized that those are good things. Like I believe in therapy. Uh, Preferably under a Christian, born again believer as a therapist, obviously. But I believe I've seen it. I've seen clinical work do amazing things. I've seen therapy. I need therapy. I could definitely use some more therapy that I've already gotten. I mean, it's great. I've seen so many people who had that breakthrough or think, oh, I figured it out is when, because my dad did this or my mom or that one guy did this to me when I was a kid, or, it's because of whatever it is, or I have bipolar, and they think that that's going to fix them, and they still relapse. They still go back to drinking and using. And so I had to realize that, yeah, there's some stuff that I need to work on, especially when it comes to trauma, stuff that happened when I was a kid, whatever. But at the end of the day, that's not what causes me to use. Like, I'm a sinful person. I'm born into sin because I'm born into Adam. And like, okay, so my sin just looks a little different than other people's sin. Maybe some people they're predisposed to, they want to be greedy. They want to make as much money as possible, or they want to, yeah, sexual immorality. They want to have sex with everybody. No one forced drugs or alcohol down my throat. When I was smoking weed for the first time, I went out and got it. No one like made me. I wasn't peer pressured. I was trying to find it for like a year before I actually did. No one wants to sell any weed to like a 13-year-old apparently. Once I understood that and took responsibility that I did the drugs, no one made me. I did it. I sought it out, and that helped a lot. Now, it didn't fix it by any means, but when I realized, I took responsibility for my own sin, basically my own actions. Mm. I've had a few. I guess I can tell you my last one, my most recent one that got me sober in 2019. So I I remember. Okay, so I for my last relapse, basically, I was 9 months clean, doing everything. I was working in the oil field, making really good money. Me and my wife is also in recovery. We have the same sobriety date. But we, ended up relapsing together this last time too. But every reason in the world to not use drugs. My life was like, oh, did you have a divorce? No. Were you poor? No, I wasn't poor. Everything was good. Me and my wife both had custody of my two nieces. We had them for a couple years. I got to be a dad for the first time, basically. Not like they were my nieces, but they were, real young, 4 and 5. Everything was great. But like what Brian was talking about with that part of the brain, like that makes you think that you have to do it. I ended up relapsing, even almost against my will, really. I relapsed, and for the next 8 months, I was doing a lot of drugs, mostly meth. I ended up, my wife was also clean for a while, and when she found out that I had relapsed, she was mad at first, but she was like me, and she didn't have any recovery or wasn't, no relationship with the Lord, none of that stuff. She did, but not at that time. She was kind of just like I was, not praying or doing anything like that. And our whole lives fell apart. My wife is my best friend, and her and I were on the verge of divorce. Um, the nieces were gone because they went back to their mom, and I lost the job. I lost the oil field job. Actually, a couple of them. I was making really good
Woo.
money. Um, but I remember I was working out in New Mexico, and I got fired. They wanted to drug test me, and I refused. So my wife came and picked me up from New Mexico. We're in Texas, a several-hour drive, and she's driving me home from New Mexico. And I just remember thinking, here it is. Here I am again. I know it's next. I've been homeless 3 times. I've been to jail. I've been to psych ward. I mean, I've been homeless, living under a bridge or whatever in a car. And I knew what was next. We hadn't paid rent. Electricity was about to get cut off. One of the cars was wrecked. I hadn't paid the payment on the other one. And I just knew what was happening. I could just see it,
The snowball.
the snowball like dominoes, and my wife and I weren't doing good, like I said. And I remember driving home, and I was like, how did I get here again? I know I've been doing this since at least 2008, trying to get sober, relapsing. Oh, I'll try this or that. I won't do this drug. I'll do that drug. I won't do drugs at all. I'll drink or I'll smoke weed, whatever it is. Or I'll just work a lot and not have to worry about using. And none of that stuff worked for me at all. Uh, my last relapse was basically I thought I could just work a lot and not, be away from home all the time and just keep my nose, on the grindstone, and I would be
Did
fine. I wouldn't.
you find that working more triggered you to want to use more? Because
Yeah,
now you're grinding, you're working, you feel obligated, you don't feel pleasure. So did that trigger you?
absolutely, because I was working 16-hour days sometimes. I was working anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks at a time without a day off. Um, Also switching from day shift to night shift, just away from home a lot. And anyway, so everything was just falling apart, And I remember driving home, and I was like, here I am again. I know it's next. I know that we're gonna get kicked out of the house. Okay, we weren't gonna have a car. I was like, here I am again. I know better than this. I've done this a million times. How am I here again? And when we got home from Texas, we didn't get clean right away. We quit doing the meth. I was also on felony probation, so if I got caught, I could look at some prison time. We got home, and we still drank. We still smoked weed, stuff like that, for about a month. And the real moment for me was sitting in my living room. I was drinking, but I didn't get any pleasure out of it. I think I fried all my pleasure center parts of my brain from doing all the meth. I was doing a lot. But my wife was drinking. We were both drinking. She was drunk, and we're sitting in the kitchen. I think my mother-in-law paid the electric bill. It's the only reason we had lights on. Car was repoed. Same thing. I just knew it was. I knew it was coming. Scraping up change, walking to go get some beer, some liquor. And I remember looking at, and I was just like, I know better than this. This is bad. Like, I love my wife dearly, and seeing her drunk and miserable and unhappy, I told her basically straight up. I was like, I'm gonna go to 12-step meeting tomorrow. And she thought it was funny at first. And the next day we left that one, we drank that night. And then May the 9th, 2019, we walked into a meeting. Basically, she followed me in there just to kind of make sure I wasn't like meeting up with girls or whatever. I don't know, but I knew what to do. I've been through meetings before. I've been through 12 steps before, so I knew I got a sponsor right away. Started working some steps, started praying and doing all the things that they were, suggesting that I do, things that I knew to do because I, had experience not only with the steps but with the Lord Jesus. I've been a
Right.
Christian since 2008 as well, and I started changing within a couple months. And then my wife also, she got busy and developed a relationship with God on, her own relationship with God, and here we are. So
That
that was, yeah.
that's awesome. So do you feel like together by her being in recovery as well as you using, do you feel like that helps
I
because she
think so.
understands you? So, but do you think that was your rock bottom? Do you think
Yeah.
that was your ultimate rock bottom or had you had one before?
I think that I've had a lot of rock bottoms, and the thing with rock bottoms is I can always dig deeper. They can
Mm.
always get lower. This bottom can be the last one. It can be my ultimate rock bottom. But I have a way of getting a jackhammer when I'm already at the bottom and breaking through the bedrock and going even further down, you know. I want to touch on the mental illness piece just real
Oh,
quick again. I want to be clear that what I'm not saying is that mental
mm-hmm.
illness doesn't play a very big role in addiction. It absolutely does. I want to make it
Right.
clear. I think that's why I think personally that um, holistic treatment is best. You want to get the spiritual side, absolutely. To me, that's the number one above all else. If that's all you can do, get the spiritual, and a lot of the rest will
Mm.
kind of work itself. You know, God will heal
Yes.
you,
Guide
form you,
you.
all that stuff. But if you can get the spiritual side along with the mental side and the body side, get physically healthy, then you stand a much better chance. And yes, mental illness plays a huge role. And I've seen some people who had the spiritual side down, or they at least knew how to do it, but when they kept in and out over and over again, they finally took time to jump into the mental health side, the clinical side of things, on top of the spiritual stuff, and they were able to get out of the cycle. So
Right. What was the thing, your first step towards recovery?
I mean, this last time it was taking some action and doing something, sitting in that kitchen, not just saying, oh, I need to get sober, I got to stop doing this, but actually getting in the car. And in my case, it was driving to a meeting. Maybe for someone else, it would be actually going to celebrate recovery, or, whatever, going to rehab, whatever it is. Rehab wasn't an option this time. I didn't have health insurance at the
Mm.
time. And just taking that action and actually doing it, and not just for one day, but day in, day out, one day at a time. That's what, there's that saying in a lot of 12-step meetings, is one day at a time. It doesn't mean that I hang on and I just barely make it a day at a time. Well, maybe I'll get high or drink tomorrow. That's not, maybe at first, the first couple of weeks, yeah, sometimes it is like that. I'll just hang on today. But what it really means is I'm going to take the action today, because I don't know, like, tomorrow's over. That's like trying to eat old food. That's like the
Right.
manna in the wilderness. It went rotten
Mm-hmm.
after the next day. You couldn't store it up. It's the same thing with prayer and with recovery, and with our relationship with God. I had to take that action every single day, and I still do. There's still certain actions that I have to take to because I've had 4.5 years before. I got 5.5 years now. Amen. Hallelujah. But
Yes.
I am, you know, I'm
Yes.
one sip of communion wine
Amen.
away from going back to the way it was. So, and I know that
At
about
any
myself.
given time, I get it. I understand. How have you integrated your faith with recovery?
And recovery, my faith has grown so much more than it's ever been since this last 5.5 years, because you know having met the Lord and became a Christian in my basically late teens, early 20s, I was on fire for Jesus. But a lot of it, honestly, it was superficial. A lot of it, and a lot I didn't know that. I didn't know that, but a lot of it was just youthful enthusiasm, I guess you could say. And I still had a lot of stuff that I think anybody in the early 20s is going to have still a lot of flesh and stuff like that. But
Or at any
um,
age?
yeah, no, it's true. It's still true
Yes.
today for me. Yeah,
There's no cap.
absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
um, but but so when I got sober this last time, I had a lot of issues with God, because I was playing, a lot of it was me playing the victim. It was like, God, why'd you do this to me? Because I kept going in and out of rehab, in and out of church, and just over and over again, I kept relapsing, even though I had those 4.5 years before. My life was great, but I kept relapsing. And a lot of it was like, I don't know. There was a time I tried to be an atheist. I'm not good at being an atheist. I've experienced too much.
Been there, done that.
Yeah, but I had these weird
I.
ideas of God.
Mm-hmm.
Weird. Just I was mad at God.
Me
I say,
too.
oh, God's a narcissist. He's if he's real, he's just a jerk. All that's just blasphemous stuff that I would say and think about. But I genuinely thought that. But when I got sober this time, I started praying, but I knew that I had to develop I guess what I would say that is the first time I ever got sober, my early 20s, that was almost like in a way somebody else's faith. I don't my belief in God was based on, mentors and people I looked up to, like, oh, they believe, so I'm going to believe. They believe this stuff is true. So I trust them. So it's almost like kind of like secondhand faith. It's hard to exactly describe, but I knew this
It was like
time,
vicariously
yeah,
living vicariously. Yeah.
in a way, I had my own
Mhm.
relationship with God, but also a lot of aspects it wasn't my own, and this time I knew I was like, I have to develop my own relationship with God. Like it has to be me and God. And I remember early on in my recovery this last time, telling God, I was like, I don't care who you are. I don't care if, you're the Christian God, the Muslim God, I don't care if the Mormons are right. I don't care. Like, I just know that I can't do this anymore. I have to get
Mhm.
sober. And God honored that, like God didn't just be like, oh, I smite thee, or, I'm going to,
Right.
I'm going to
Nothing like
reject
that.
you.
Right.
No, and, a lot of people would probably not, they'd probably cringe when they hear me say that, but that's where I was at. That
Mhm.
was the most honest I could possibly be. I wasn't going to fake anything. And over the course of like 2 years, I started reading the Bible again, and I got my
That'll do it.
own, like, Jesus showed me who he was. God was like, I was like, okay, whoever you are. And he made it a point uh, to where now my walk with Jesus, it's my own. I know for a fact that Jesus Christ is Lord, and that the God of the Bible is the God, the one and only God.
Yes,
I know
one
that
and
for a
only
fact
true
now.
God. What do you think about the facilities and how are they meeting the needs of of addicts? What do you think? Do you think they're
Oh man,
conducive?
I think it's just like anything else. There's so a lot of treatment facilities. I work at one, and I've worked at, this is my second ever place I've ever worked, and I can tell you that, my last place I was there for 4 years or so. I've been the one I'm at now for a year, and those two places are very much conducive. Like they actually care to help people, and it's not just a money grab. But at the end of the day, also treatment facilities are businesses. If they're privately owned, and they have
Absolutely.
to they have to make money, and
Mhm.
that's kind of the nasty part of the beast. But
Mhm.
having been on this side of it, working in treatment and dealing with other facilities, as I'm a case manager right now, so sometimes I deal with other facilities. I've seen there's some places that are, they're not conducive at all. There's
Mhm.
this thing called, it's out in Florida, out in California. There's this thing called body brokering, which is basically where uh, they pay your insurance premium, and then they give you drugs or give you money. Say, hey, we'll give you $5,000 if you come to our treatment facility, but you got to pee dirty. You have to fail for some kind of drug,
That is so
and
true. That's
and
absolutely true.
and it's disgusting. And then they go in
Mhm.
there, they stay there for however long, they bill their insurance, they get out, and they say, hey, here's another $5,000. We'll come back to treatment, get paid for just hanging out, and it's disgusting.
Right, right.
And
It is.
and
It's a monster, and I feel
yeah,
like some of them in California, at least, honestly, if it's not faith based, I feel like it's a hamster wheel,
yeah,
and they know that they're going to use and come back and keep. It's like a revolving door, and
yep,
it's a cash cow. It's always going to make
yep,
them money, and they fail them. I've even had the county of Riverside, unfortunately, they rejected my son because he's been there a few times, which I think
yeah,
is crazy because you're dealing with an addict and some people are addicts for decades.
yeah,
So how would you,
yeah,
how they're failing them? And like he said, it affects the brain, so they need it. And I didn't know that alcohol, if you're an alcoholic, which my son is that too, he does meth and alcohol. Um if you don't have it and you drink it all the time, you could die.
yep, you sure
I
can.
had no clue,
Yep.
you know? So it's a lot of things that I had to learn. What would your advice be for family members who are
Fa-
struggling with or helping a person or so what would you do with a family member that's helping support an
mm.
struggling with addiction?
I would say first and foremost, I highly recommend. It's called Al-Anon. You may have heard of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a
And
12-step
Coda.
program. Yeah, Coda,
Mm-hmm.
Codependency
Mm-hmm.
Anonymous. Absolutely. These are, I mean, they're specifically for the families. They are basically 12-step programs for the family member or friend or whatever suffering from addiction and alcoholism. And they just they help you, like what Brian was saying. They help you. You got to take care of yourself, and then
Mm-hmm.
the rest becomes a lot different because you're not in control of your family member, but you are in control of yourself. So if you can get right, it actually stands a better chance of your family member getting sober, getting right, because you won't enable them anymore. You won't also be overbearing. You will learn how to love them from a distance, if necessary. Sometimes you got to be tough love. But if they do get right, I've seen a lot of family members, unfortunately, that even when their son or daughter actually gets sober, gets clean, starts doing right, they're so used to that. It's almost like it's an interesting thing. But
Right. They
sometimes they
kind of get
actually,
numb to them and they're expecting it's PTSD.
yeah,
It's
yeah, absolutely.
PTSD. I really believe you're traumatized by what you've gone through with them in the past, so you're
Yep,
expecting a turn instead of being optimistic
yep,
and supporting them
yeah,
in the fact
it's
that they're
true.
actually healing, and recovering.
Yeah,
Yeah, I really appreciate this. I really appreciate this because there's so much more, and I would love to do another one. You could even interview me because I plan on discussing my story as well. But this has been
okay.
a great discussion. I really appreciate you hopping on here with me, and I will be in touch. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's an honor. Have a great
Thank
evening. I don't want to hold you too long.
This concludes episodes 2 and 3 of my addiction series, The Mind of an Addict and a Road to Recovery. Thanks for listening, and I hope you got some valuable information from this. Stay tuned for more.